Today's event's going to be a little bit different. It's a fireside chat. This is going to be on our website as well as a special episode of the podcast as well. So that's why the camera is really close to help record us. So hopefully there's not like a lot of paper ruffling, but it'll happen. So thanks everyone for coming to what is now the 10th event of the Feminist and Accessible Publishing, Communications and Technology Speaker and Workshop Series. I'm Dr. Alex Ketchum. I'm the faculty lecturer at the Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies here at McGill. Part of this series, the point of this series, is to bring together scholars, people in the industry, artists, working at the intersections of digital humanities, computer science, feminist studies, critical race studies, disability studies, communication studies, LGBTQ studies, and history. So a lot of different fields coming together. We have speakers from all over these disciplines talking about technology. You've probably noticed there's a lot of talks about artificial intelligence, but also about publishing, how we talk about these issues, and so forth. Part of the motivation of this series is that oftentimes humanities and social studies scholars will critique traditional academic publishing for being classist, racist, and inaccessible, but the types of solutions that are often proffered also replicate some of these same issues, especially when they rely on this idea of technology in a vague way and don't actually pay attention to how algorithms can perpetuate many of these same issues. So as we seek to draw attention to power relations that have long been invisibilized, it's also important to acknowledge the land that we're on. So both taking part to acknowledge Canada's long colonial history, we're on unceded territory, as well as Canada's ongoing political practices, and also to acknowledge that James McGill owned slaves, right? So we really need to pay attention to the context that we're in. This series was made possible by so many different founders, from SSHRC to the IGSF, to Mila at UDM. Basically every university in the city gave money, as well as a lot of different organizations, to make sure that all of our events could be free and open to the public, and also recorded when possible. So please check out our multiple different forms of social media. Follow us on Facebook and look at our website. If this is like too long of a URL, you can also go to disruptingdisruptions.com, and it's an automatic redirect. So some upcoming events to let you know about are Meredith Whitaker, the co-founder of the AI Now Institute in New York City, will be speaking in January, as well as Abigail Ecohawk, who will be talking about decolonizing data, and Ruha Benjamin, who will be talking about the new Jim Code later in November. In case any of your friends or colleagues can see this, again, we put videos up of most of these events on our website that you can access through that way or through our YouTube channel. So our next event is, we're going to have a workshop on feminist podcasting tomorrow, again, with Hannah McGregor. And then we also, on Tuesday, will have a workshop on small press publishing with Metonymy Press that focuses on queer and marginalized authors, and they're based out of Montreal. So that'll be another like lunchtime kind of workshop that you can attend. Okay. So now for today's event, I'm going to just do a bio, and then this is going to be basically a fireside chat. We're going to talk for a while, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So I hope you're all excited. I've been so excited for this event. I'm trying not to fangirl, because I definitely listen to every episode of Secret Feminist Agenda.
So I feel like if it's a fireside chat, we should have drawn a fire on the blackboard. It's like an illustration.
Dr. Hannah McGregor is a professor at SFU and is the creator of the peer-reviewed podcast Secret Feminist Agenda. I hope many of you have checked it out. If you're in some of my classes, it's on the syllabi, so check it out. But also is the co-creator of Witch Please, a Harry Potter themed podcast. So I mentioned that she's an assistant professor in the department or program of publishing program.
We're a program.
Okay. Yeah. Program of Publishing at SFU, where her research and teaching focuses on the links between publishing and social change, from the role podcasts might play in expanding public engagement with research to systematic barriers to access in the Canadian publishing industry. So maybe we can welcome Hannah. And thank you. And thank you all for coming to this talk. So we're going to start off with the questions pretty broadly. So I'm just going to begin with, where do you see the relationship between accessible scholarship and feminist scholarship? Is it a requirement or an imperative that feminist scholarship or feminist scholarly practice be accessible?
Oh gosh, I really think so. I really, really do. So it was a gradual process for me of coming to really prioritizing open access, accessible, and what I think of as community accountable publishing, which is sort of like 3 stages for me. So like open access is the bare bones, as in like you haven't literally paywalled it so that people who aren't at universities can't get it. And then the next step is like, okay, then how is that made accessible, which means accessible to folks with disabilities, because open access doesn't necessarily mean accessible. And then accountable, which means that not only is it available to people, but like it actually answers to the public that you're offering it to, so that people can engage with your work and then respond to you about it and like ask you questions or maybe correct you, which is like a whole another level of things with scholarly publishing. But I don't know, I came to the personal conclusion probably only a couple of years ago, probably really only after I got really into podcasting, that it didn't make any sense to be espousing feminist values and then producing work in a context where literally people had to buy it from me by virtue of their membership in an elitist institution. That seemed really at odds with the kind of work that I was trying to do.
And previous to podcasting, like what were some of your other kind of productions that weren't within those like journals and?
Podcasting
Yeah.
I got into, before I got into podcasting, I got into the digital humanities, which is a field that does a lot of sort of open, non-traditional forms of publishing. And so I was doing work in that realm, but I was mostly I started making Witch Please during my postdoc. I was still pretty fresh out of grad school. I wasn't publishing a ton yet. So Witch Please kind of emerged at the same time as I started publishing as a scholar, as I started sort of figuring out the kind of platform I wanted to build for myself as a scholar. So that openness kind of became central to my work fairly early on.
Okay. Yeah. And you kind of touched on how you view accessible and how it's different than open access and such, but I'm curious how you're defining feminism in your podcast, right? It's like secret feminist agenda, but there's also different types of feminism. Yeah. So like how do you kind of bring it together, or how you're defining it, or are you close-ending it or leaving it open? Or?
Oh yeah, I've got a couple of hard limits on what I consider to constitute feminism. So there are people in communities who use the word feminist that I do not consider to constitute feminists, that would not be welcome on secret feminist agenda. And I'm thinking particularly of trans exclusive feminists who I would never have on my podcast and would not, I'm not interested in having a conversation with. But beyond that, I try really hard to keep the definition as open as possible. The secret feminist agenda for me is, while I often define the guests I have on the podcast as feminists, like I say, it's a podcast where I talk to other feminists, I actually usually use that language because I don't want to say that I talk to other women, because my guests are not always women. I have had a number of non-binary guests. I have never had a man on the podcast, but that doesn't mean I won't. It just means I haven't found any interesting ones yet. I tend to say, I'm talking to other feminists on the podcast, but I actually often open up the conversation by asking people to talk through with me their understanding of their own feminism. And I think it's really important that sometimes my guests don't comfortably identify as feminists for complex reasons. For example, in a fairly early episode, I was talking to Alicia Elliott, who's a Haudenosaunee writer. It's a really amazing new book called A Mind Spread Out on the Ground. If you haven't all read it yet, it's really, really good. And I asked her, how she positioned herself in relation to feminism, and she said, that her own understanding of gender politics emerges out of the matriarchal history of the Haudenosaunee, and that in fact, a lot of early white feminists appropriated those gender relations that they observed and then used those as a sort of foundation for early white feminist thought. And she was like, so, I'm kind of not super comfortable with the label feminist sometimes because of that history. And so I try really hard to say, I'm not going to demand you identify as a feminist on the same terms that I do. And so increasingly the way I think about it as a feminist project is that feminism is my method. Like it's central to what I'm doing and how I'm doing it, rather than necessarily having to be the content. In fact, less and less with each episode do I actually necessarily say the word feminism out loud. Like there's probably a lot of episodes where I never explicitly talk about it. Instead, we're just talking about like the work my guest is doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're going to shift gear. I didn't respond very well to that. I'm like, yes, I concur.
Yeah. But like feminism as method, right? And like, what does that mean for me? It means openness. It means inclusivity. It means listening to where people are coming from. It means being constantly responsive to the difference of my guests and like the really embodied differences of my guests. It means being ready to have hard conversations. It means being accountable and responsive to my audience. It means that when people write to me and say that they had trouble with something I said, that I listen. Like, so there's all of these pieces of the method for me that are like, how am I relating to the people on the podcast? How am I relating to the people who are listening? And that for me is a lot of where the feminism of the project comes through.
And as you're talking about method too, so for those of you who don't know or missed it in the introduction, the podcast itself is peer-reviewed, which is like in a very experimental kind of like project in itself. And Siobhan McMenemy.
Siobhan McMenemy.
Yeah.
Hardest name in publishing.
Siobhan McMenemy is your editor, right? Editor, publisher.
And my collaborator, because we are co-researchers on a research grant.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Siobhan had released something that you can all check out. It was put on the Wilfrid Laurier Press website. A really great piece about how some of the thoughts through making a peer review process for Secret Feminist Agenda went. And it was shared on social media. But I actually want to hear some of your reflections about this as well. And I'm wondering about how first that initial idea came up to make it peer-reviewed.
Yeah, so I had already been podcasting for some time before I started making Secret Feminist Agenda. We've been making Witch Please for a few years. And Witch Please, has anybody ever listened to Witch Please? It's pretty silly. And it took a little while before Marcel and I were sort of, my collaborator on it, before we were convinced that what we were doing there might be scholarly. And a large part of that is that she was still in grad school, I was fresh out of grad school. We had both internalized pretty intensely what the university had told us constituted the scholarly, and that was like serious. You had to be serious if you were going to be a scholar. And we're very silly on the podcast. And so it took me a while to really think like, oh, well, maybe this work that I'm doing counts as scholarship. And so I started to get interested in the idea of doing a podcast that was more intentionally scholarly, that I sort of set out from the beginning to think, this is going to be a scholarly project. And a big part of the motivation for that was that we have a tendency in the university to simultaneously want and massively undervalue public work, by which I mean we talk about our universities as being public institutions. We ask scholars to be public facing. We ask people to be out there talking to the media. But none of that work matters. The work that matters is peer-reviewed work. So like if you want to actually get a job or get tenure or get promoted, you have to be doing these like serious peer-reviewed things. And so you end up doing all the public stuff kind of off the side of your desk. It's this like extra work you're expected to do, but you're not promoted for it, you're not valued for it. My colleague at SFU, Juan Pablo Alperin, recently published an article with a bunch of his colleagues out of the Scholarly Communication Lab where they looked at the tenure and promotion documents from universities across North America to see how, and tenure and promotion documents like super matter because they determine like who gets jobs, who gets tenure, who gets raises. So they were looking at how they talked about public scholarship or public engagement, and their findings were like, nobody cares. Like universities claim that they want to be publicly engaged institutions, but when you look at where things matter, which is the tenure and promotion documents, nobody cares. And there is a disproportionate burden of doing publicly engaged scholarship that falls on racialized faculty. That is just always the case at every institution, particularly Black and Indigenous faculty tend to disproportionately be involved in publicly engaged or community engaged work. So all of this is to say that when I started thinking about what it meant for me to move forward with doing public scholarship, I was really interested in trying to build infrastructure so that we can start to value public scholarship as real scholarship, not always as an extra thing that you have to do in addition to all of the other work, because that feels to me like an equity issue. I think that if we want a university that has diverse faculty, has diverse students, is engaged with communities, then we have to be treating public scholarship like it's real scholarship. And so Siobhan and I applied for a grant. The point was that we were going to make a podcast and peer review it. And in my head, I was like, and it's going to be scholarly, which means it will be very serious. We're going to make a serious podcast. And then, unrelated, I started Secret Feminist Agenda for fun because I got bored one day and decided to start a new podcast. And I was a few months into Secret Feminist Agenda, and then I sent Siobhan an email and was like, yeah, so it's time that we start thinking about what our podcast is going to be about. And she was like, isn't Secret Feminist Agenda the scholarly podcast? And I was like, no, it's not scholarly. It's just me having conversations about feminism with scholars. That's not scholarship. I was wrong. But that, it's exactly that same trap that I fell back into, which was I was having fun and I was doing something that I enjoyed, so it couldn't possibly be real scholarship.
Yeah.
So it was this kind of I really fell backwards into it again. I've really had to unlearn a ton of my internalized sense of what counts as scholarly.
Mm-hmm. And in recent episodes too, you've been talking a lot about the role of emotion and kind of how you're dealing with emotion in your scholarship and what that means for you.
Yeah.
I'm curious, kind of following up too about this whole idea of serious academic work too, is that do you think you would have started this process of the peer review of the podcast had you already had tenure?
Such a good question. So a big part of why I would say I start maybe 95% of my projects out of belligerence. It's a strong motivating factor for me. And I had been having a conversation not too long before we started the project with somebody I met at a modernist studies conference who had moved from modernist studies into comic book studies and was telling me, at that time I just had Witch Please, and he had a comic studies podcast. And I was like, oh, that's really cool. Do you have that on your CV? Do you count that as part of your scholarship? And he said, I don't need to put it on my CV, I have tenure. And I said, well, but as a person with tenure, shouldn't you be working to get that kind of work legitimized so that you can pave the way for junior scholars who don't have tenure yet, so that when they're doing that kind of public work, that will be taken seriously? And he was like, nah. I was like, fuck you, we're peer reviewing podcasts.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
And so as the peer review has been going on, I'm sure because it's been quite experimental, and you can actually follow on the website, kind of how the peer review process has gone a bit.
It's open peer review, so you can read all of the peer reviews. They're all up on the website. You can read, we've done 2 seasons of peer review, so you can read peer reviews by 4 different scholars and my responses to them.
And I'm curious how, if you knew what you knew now when you started, how would you have adjusted the peer review process? What kind of changes would you have made?
Yeah, I don't think we would have made any changes. So the way that we went about it is we used the peer review as an iterative way to develop the podcast as I was going, and also to figure out how we were going to do the peer review. So when I say I wouldn't have done it differently, it's because we wouldn't have learned what we know now if we hadn't done it the way we did it. And that was had to be part of the experiment. So in the first round of peer review, we asked a lot of questions. We asked some questions about the podcast itself, but we asked a lot of questions that were like, do you think podcasts count as scholarship? Do you think this peer review method makes sense? What would you do differently? So we were asking these sort of meta questions so that people could reflect on the project itself. And that helped me make the second season better, but it also helped us refine how we did the second round of peer review and reshape the questions and do that differently. And then the response from the second round of the peer review not only informed season 3, but also informed, so for our third round of peer review, it's going to be released as podcast episodes.
Okay.
So it will be actual like oral peer review. But we weren't ready to do that yet with the first two. We needed to like figure out if everything else was working first. So it's been a really good process of like sort of experimenting as we went to figure out if this was going to work at all. Because right from the beginning we were like, maybe you can't peer review podcasts. We don't know. We'll find out. And we got some really interesting feminist scholars on board who were really willing to come with us on this project and like take the project at face value, embrace it in the spirit in which we were doing it, and really try to help us make it better.
And is there a goal to kind of create some kind of framework for other podcasts to be peer reviewed?
Yeah.
That's kind of what we did last there.
Yeah, so the next step is Siobhan and I are putting together another grant, and the goal is essentially that we're going to build this work out into a like peer-reviewed scholarly podcast network. So there will be podcasts from other folks on different topics that become part of it. So our next, so like the people that we're bringing in, and this is like we haven't gotten this grant yet, so who knows, question, just giant shrug. But we have a podcast from Daniel Heath Justice, who's an Indigenous Studies scholar at UBC, who's going to do an Indigenous podcast about relations to animals, like animals of different species. And then Brenna Clark-Gray, who is a post-secondary pedagogy specialist out of Thompson Rivers University, who's going to talk about like the actual strategies for teaching at the post-secondary level. And then we're also working with this Montreal-based project called Spoken Web. And Spoken Web is a project that is dedicated to digitizing and then mobilizing literary audio archives. So the audio recordings of literary events like poetry readings. And we're making a podcast where we're essentially sort of experimenting with how to do sound-based scholarship when you're working with a sound-based archive. And then, so that podcast is coming out right now. When's the first episode out?
October 7th.
First episode's coming out on October 7th, as hosted by Catherine McLeod. And we're going to, I have some schemes for how we might bring that into the peer review process as well, but we're going to use the different podcasts as an experiment to try some different methods so that we're not going with like a one-size-fits-all, everything should be peer reviewed in exactly the same way kind of attitude, but instead with a like peer review can and should be responsive to like the nature of the scholarly project.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that also gets to kind of another topic and kind of aspect of feminist and accessible publishing and podcasting more generally, is that right, like also the nature of who is doing that work. And so I want to ask you about reception and how the podcast has, like how people responded to it. I know in the past on the Métis in Space episode, you talked about how sometimes you're less likely to get trolls because people aren't necessarily going to listen to a 45-minute podcast. And
yeah, if they hate women, they're not going to listen to me talk for 45 minutes.
Yeah,
because I got this voice.
But while simultaneously, right, as you talk about this onus being put on, especially scholars of color, but also women to do this kind of public-facing work. And so I'm wondering here about kind of how you're trying to make sense of this whole hello, I'm a lady on the internet phenomenon and the kind of like vitriol that can come back within doing this kind of public-facing, accessible feminist scholarship.
Yeah, there's a great early Kate Beaton comic when she did like before, you know, Kate Beaton, just like, yeah, before she was doing like her sort of current recognizable comics, she did these like really simple like MS Paint kind of stick person comics that you can still find deep in her archives. And there's this great one where she like logs onto the internet and then somebody's like, "You're pretty, can you marry me now?" And the tagline is, "Whoops, I'm a lady on the internet." And it's just really great. It just really summarizes the whole experience. Yeah, so it is, okay. SFU has recently created this series of workshops that is intended to help engage women faculty more in the public-facing aspects of our work, because male faculty are disproportionately more likely to get tapped as experts by the media and are also significantly more likely to agree to speak as experts even when they're not quite experts in the thing they are being asked to speak in. And there's studies of this. Women are significantly less likely to recognize our own expertise. We're significantly less likely to take up opportunities. We're less likely to put ourselves forward. We all know why, right? The patriarchy. So SFU has created this program that's trying to train women faculty to be better at speaking to the media, to explain our research, all this kind of stuff, so that we are putting ourselves forward more. I'm not doing the series because I already speak to the media all the time, but I was talking to the people who were organizing it, and I said, is there a component to this workshop series that equips people with what to do if they're being trolled or doxxed? And they were like, no, why? And I was like, oh, cool. So you're asking women faculty who will often be doing work that is on gender studies, that is on critical race studies, that is on social justice, that is going to get trolled if they are doing it publicly. You are placing the onus on them to do that work publicly, and then you are providing no support or training for the consequences of what happens when you do that work. So it is like, even with podcasting, which for the most part, I have one episode of Secret Feminist Agenda for which I have been badly and consistently trolled, because in that episode I called Margaret Atwood a shitty white woman, which I stand by. I do think she is a shitty white woman. And that made a lot of people very angry and circulated and continues to circulate and continues to every once in a while sort of pop back up. But for the most part, again, people are just not going to listen to me if they don't like me. They're just going to tap out. The work of mine that tends to get more aggressively trolled is my Twitter feed, or I edited a book last year that was about like rape culture and sexual assault in the world of Canadian literature and Canadian publishing, and people were very mad about that book. Very, very mad. But podcasting is actually kind of, like, it's that audio thing. And I think it's mostly because we haven't figured out how to make audio searchable. So people can't put like keyword searches out to like find things that I'm saying that will make them mad. Mm-hmm. Like, it's just kind of like, I don't want to claim that it's like a safe space. I just think it's like, because of the fact that it's like circulated via MP3s and we are not good at searching MP3s yet, that it's just kind of like a little harder to detect via algorithms. Mm-hmm. So it's just a little harder for people to like find me there.
Two things that you said brought up like a couple of other topics. So we don't have the same thing. Oh no, but more about that. Like SFU has this program as well, but there's also more broadly FemExPail for francophones and informed opinions as well of these same types of organizations trying to train women scholars, but again, not being aware of the fact that while we often talk about accessibility as something for the public, we don't talk about what's accessible to the scholars within the academy of what's accessible to them and what they can do. And that's not even talking about like being able to like sleep and rest and all of those things as a scholar.
All of those things. And the unbelievable, I was reading an article by Tressie McMillan Cottom, who's a black feminist sociologist in the States, who does a huge amount of public-facing work. She's got a podcast with Roxanne Gay. She's a big deal. And she wrote this piece about what it's like being, like, the degree of public black feminist that she is, that she had to petition her university to delist her email and her phone number because otherwise she was literally incapable of getting work done because people were sending her like hate emails and trying to phone her so constantly that like her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Like, but she had to like beg her institution to do that because they were like, well, no, we're a public facing institution. And it's like, okay, this, and you feel like this is comparable to the way that like Indigenous scholars have critiqued open access as this universal good, as though all knowledge should be for everybody all the time. And it's this similar kind of thing. It's like, yes, public, absolutely. Let's nuance what it means to do work that is public, the way that publicness extols a different price from different people, depending on how we're positioned, that you are asking a lot more for some people to be public than for other people to be public. and that like you have to understand that, and that the flip side of asking scholars to do our work publicly, which I think is legitimate, is that you have to think about the kinds of support we're going to need.
Definitely, and that the university needs to take that support seriously and not just say,
Yeah.
oh, what is Twitter, right? That kind of
what is
response.
Yeah, and that's happened like when that it wasn't the Atwood page. Anyway, something that I said that made somebody mad. It was the Atwood article. It was when somebody mentioned my podcast and how I had critiqued Atwood in a newspaper article, and it went viral, and there were so many tweets tagging my institution that like our university communications got in touch with my department chair to be like, what do we do? Everybody's saying you should fire her. And it was fine because I have academic freedom, I have a faculty union, and I have a really good department full of people who respect me and value the work that I do. So I am protected, that is fine. But like, what if I'd had a department chair that was like, shut up or we're not renewing you? Like, would I have been protected? Would my faculty association have been able to have my back? Would I have been easily silenced just by the pressure of the fact that I am an untenured faculty member? Like, it's hard to say, and it shouldn't come down to there being like a nice person who happens to be my department chair.
Definitely.
Even though I value that nice person who is my department chair.
And speaking about your department a bit, I'm going to shift again to pedagogy. And so I'm going to ask this in kind of a two-part question. So one is, do you see your podcast as part of your pedagogy? And then, actually, we'll just start there.
Yeah.
We'll start with.
Yeah, so one of the most interesting things that comes up on that, in those 2 seasons of the peer review, is that the peer reviewers are kind of like among themselves grappling with the question of how to categorize secret feminist agenda and what I'm doing on it. So one peer reviewer says, this is really service, like in the same way that organizing a lecture series is service, or that editing a journal is service. Like what I'm doing is gathering voices together, giving them a platform. They're like, this counts and service should be taken more seriously, but it's not really research. And then somebody else said, this is really teaching. Like really what you're doing on the podcast is public pedagogy. Like you're doing the same thing you do in a classroom. I'm unpacking complex ideas for an audience of people who don't necessarily have the same specializations that I do. I'm trying to make my work open and accessible for a broader public. This is public pedagogy. And then other peer reviewers have said, no, this is research. This reads like research to us. And ultimately, the conclusion that they all come to is that the division of what we do in a university into research, pedagogy, and service, in that order, because that's how the university values them, research, pedagogy, service, like a very reverse upside down triangle, that's a deeply false way to divide the realities of the work that we do. Mm-hmm. Like, my research wouldn't exist without pedagogy. Like, I get all of my energy and my ideas and my passion for my projects through classrooms, through conversations with students, through those interactions. And my pedagogy would be bad without my research because I wouldn't have anything interesting to tell them. I wouldn't be an area specialist. And all of this work ties together, and the way that we've divided them out creates not only this deeply artificial division, but also this really structured hierarchy in the institution that ends up. Guess who benefits?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody want to guess who benefits from that hierarchy? It's white men. It is. That's the way it works, right? The service falls disproportionately on women and racialized faculty, always. Teaching, sessionals are significantly more likely to be women and people of color. Full professors are significantly more likely to be white men. It's that whole, that hierarchy of the work that we value follows the sort of hierarchy of how power is structured in our society. And so the whole point of this is that the more I make secret feminist agenda, the less I'm convinced that I can actually divide out my pedagogy and my research in any meaningful way, or that I want to do research that isn't kind of pedagogical or pedagogy that isn't research-based. Mm-hmm. They just feel for me like they need to just be friends. Mm-hmm.
And the service component within that too, right?
Absolutely,
I mean, I see them as being so integral to each other. like with this series too, right? That's like a huge part of this series.
Yeah.
So also in terms of like audiences, right? Like in some ways you're talking like this is to the public, this sometimes is to other scholars, but who is your imagined audience when you're creating this podcast?
Yeah, I have a really specific audience in my head, and that is the listeners, the people who I realized were interested in this kind of podcasting via Witch Please. So when we started making Witch Please, our imagined audience was like 3 people who were our friends. Like that's what we thought. We thought, well, we'll put it on a website and 3 of our friends will listen to it and that would be cool. But mostly we're making it for us. And then people started listening, and then and then strangers started listening. And what I realized early on is that a significant subset of our listenership was young, as in younger than me, politicized women and feminists who were hungry for conversations that were both politically and theoretically grounded, that provided a sort of critical tool set and framework to think through issues like gender and race as they play out in Harry Potter, that were hungry for that work and weren't finding it elsewhere, weren't finding opportunities to get really like theoretically rigorous discussions of stuff that felt relevant to them. And that's who I had in my mind when I started making Secret Feminist Agenda. People who I knew were out there, who I knew were hungry for those conversations, who I knew weren't necessarily finding them elsewhere.
And has that changed? Like your okay.
No, that's
So
still who
there's
I'm
still
making
the
it
ones
for.
who you're making it
And
for.
other people I know, colleagues of mine, more colleagues of mine listen to a Secret Feminist Agenda than listen to Witch Please. Because Witch Please is like really very about Harry Potter. A lot more people listened to Witch Please than listened to Secret Feminist Agenda. So the percentages and demographics changed, but that's still the audience in my head.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
It's always a 25-year-old feminist wearing green lipstick. That's just who I'm podcasting to.
For those of you who are aware of the podcast, for the first 2 seasons, Karina had the self-care corner, and so and this year you're doing the feminist killjoy
survival kit. Yeah.
Survival kit, and Sarah Ahmed's actually coming next week to talk at McGill, which is really exciting.
Is it public?
It is, but the tickets sold out within 6 minutes.
Of course they did.
But yeah, so I'm just curious, is the podcast part of your survival toolkit?
Oh yeah, for sure. So I started making, like I mentioned, I started making Secret Feminist Agenda just for fun one day. It was at the end of my first year at my job at Simon Fraser. And so we were talking about this before we started, but one of the hard parts of being an academic is that you have to rip up your roots and displace yourself time and time and time again. So I move every 3 to 4 years. I have moved every 3 to 4 years throughout my adulthood. I am constantly moving. Like I moved to do my undergrad, then my master's, then my PhD, then a postdoc, then moved for my job. And every single time it's like you arrive in a new city, you build a community, and then 3 or 4 years later, you have to say goodbye to everybody you know and love and move to a different city where you don't know anybody, which gets so exhausting. And so I'd been in Vancouver for a year. I was starting to put down roots. Vancouver's a hard city. It's quite an isolating city for a variety of reasons that mostly has to do with the incredibly high cost of living and how that isolates people. But I felt really lonely. I really missed the community that I'd had in Edmonton before I moved. I really missed making Witch Please with Marcel, which we'd had to stop doing so that she could focus on her PhD. And I was like, God, I just need to spend more time talking to feminists, because when I don't spend enough time talking to feminists, I just start to gaslight myself like crazy. Like I start to convince myself that it's totally reasonable that colleagues of mine are demanding that I have extensive email conversations with them, personally helping them to understand why we shouldn't be supporting like a trans-exclusive feminist library in Vancouver. And that's like, oh yeah, it's totally reasonable that I'm spending an extra 5 hours tonight writing emails, doing research for this person because they've decided it's my problem to help them understand what a TERF is because they've never heard of this before. And like that just, like if there's nobody else I can talk to and be like, that's not my problem, right? And the person will be like, yeah, no, that's not your problem. Stop sending those emails. Then I just start to like get in my head and be like, this must just be my job. And the more time I spend talking to other feminists, like not only does it help me to like ungaslight myself and like believe myself about my own experiences, but it also massively expands my understanding of the world, right? I see experiences from people whose lives are different from me, and have the opportunity to say to people like, oh, that's what's happening to you. I'm gonna validate and confirm that, and like also now try to like live my life in a different way that like is shaped by this understanding you've given me. So yeah, like Secret Feminist Agenda became for me a vital way to build and sustain feminist community. And like in some ways, literally, like I made friends in Vancouver through this podcast. I just found interesting feminists on the internet and was like, would you like to be on my podcast? You have to come to my home. Oops, you're a friend now. That's how I met a lot of my friends in Vancouver. It worked. Podcasts are great ways to trick people into being your friends. And then, you know, have built and sustained this feminist community more widely. And I kind of thought I would stop making it after the 3rd season because podcasting is exhausting and it takes up a lot of my time. But when I contemplated not making another season, I was like, well, but how will I make new feminist friends? So.
And is that also one of the reasons you decided to make the new season really focused on the Vancouver area as well?
It was actually more that, so the 4th season is I'm only talking to Vancouver-based folks, and it was more that like, as I have started to make more connections in my own city, to collaborate more with community, to just know the community there more, there started being more and more people who I like met in person and was like, oh, I really want to actually sit down and talk with you, or I really want to have more of a conversation or learn more about this thing that's happening. And so it's just a way to sort of apply an artificial constraint to help what has become sort of an overwhelming number of potential guests.
Okay.
And also I've started, so the podcast has been going for long enough and is successful enough now that I've started getting a lot of pitches. Like a lot of people email me suggesting people to be like publishers and film festival reps and stuff, email me pitching guests, and saying that I'm doing local only is a way for me to say no to everyone.
Okay.
Otherwise it's really hard.
Yeah.
Because every time somebody pitches me a guest, they're super interesting. So it's really hard for me to say no.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's been also like a shift, right? More people pitching as the podcast has gone on.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, nobody was pitching when, like, the first episode was me and my friend Zine sitting in a park on a park bench with my little portable recording kit and me being like, so what do you think we should do for this podcast? Like, no, I had no idea what it was going to be.
So that also brings me up to, we're almost to the part of audience questions, don't worry. Because I know some people are like really excited to ask some things.
About peer review, right? Everybody here's stoked to ask follow-up questions about peer review.
But one thing is like, so for those of you who know, right, I would say music is an important part of this podcast, right? The theme song is Mesher by Mom Jean's author album Chub Rub. And it seems like every guest...
Did I mostly choose that because of Chub Rub? Yes.
And every guest has their own theme song. So one, I just want to know, like, why did you, what was the thought behind some of your musical theme choices? And then also, do guests pick their own theme songs? Like, how does that work?
They do. Guests pick their own theme songs. So after I've interviewed somebody, I send them a follow-up email that's like, can I have a headshot, the bio, because I read their bio out in the introduction, any links, like anything you want me to link to, and what is your theme song? So people always choose their own theme songs. And that was inspired by the fact that in that very first episode, I was talking to Zine, and she made a joke. We were talking about Yuri on Ice. Does anybody watch Yuri on Ice? A very excellent gay figure skating anime. It's really remarkable. You have a lot of homework to do. Everybody go watch it. And it has this incredible theme song. And Zine and I were talking about how much we loved this song, and Zine was like, oh my god, it should be my theme song, like you should use it to introduce me on the podcast. And I was like, yeah, okay. So I did that just because she kind of offhandedly suggested it, And then because I had done it in the first episode, now I have to do it in every episode forever.
Okay.
Which is what happens when you start a new podcast. Make your decisions carefully, otherwise you're going to get trapped.
And I guess I want to ask one more question before we open it up. But in terms of, because you said you were considering ending it after season 3, now there's season 4, and I'm just kind of curious how you see this as living on, right? Podcast people can listen to it for years after you've produced it. People might interact with the materials over and over. You know, some of the things that we talked about 5 years ago, then we like look back and are like, oh, why did I say that? And I'm kind of curious how you see like what's going to happen to this podcast, if like what you want to do to maybe like archive it or save it, and kind of the plans of how you see it living on or maybe not living on.
Yeah, so it's a thing that I realized with Witch Please, that while you are like, you kind of think of the podcast because it's coming out serially in this timely fashion, and so you think of like all of your listeners being there with you, listening to the episodes when they come out. But of course, new people come on board all the time, and often more so with Witch Please than Secret Feminist Agenda, because Witch Please was progressively talking through the Harry Potter series in order. When people start listening to that, they start at the beginning. And so we'd be like on the Witch Please Twitter, and people would be like, this actually happened to me just last week. Somebody was like, in episode 4.5 of Witch Please, you make a passing reference to a fan theory that your friend Sylvie mentioned to you in a conversation. Do you recall that fan theory? And I'm like, no! Wow! Absolutely not. But that's what, like, somebody's just started listening, and so they're there. Like, it feels like it is the present moment to them, even though it was 3 years ago for me, and I don't remember what happened yesterday. So there is that, like, sort of asynchronous nature to how people engage with podcasting, and a function of that, more so again with Witch Please, because Marcella and I were very new at being public feminists. We fucked up a lot, especially with early episodes. We said shit that we would not say now because we were not imagining an audience, and so we're not thinking about the impact of what we were saying on other human beings. And we made a decision pretty early on that when people wrote to us and said, you know, I am troubled by this thing that you have said, that if they wanted us to change it, we would. But for the most part, that we were going to leave them as is, because we didn't want to retroactively erase the fact that we both did a lot of learning through the process of making the podcast and through the ways in which our audience taught us. And we wanted that to be there because that was such a formative part of this project, is that our audience responded to us and made us better people by saying things to us like, you made a really shitty joke about diabetes in that episode. That was a hateful and ableist thing to say. And I was like, shit, wow, great point. I'm going to really go think about that. I'm going to really work on my internalized ableism. I'm going to work on the language that I use. And I don't want to then go retcon and be like, haha, been perfect the whole time. Like, I want that to remain there. And what that means is that new people who come on and listen for the first time re-encounter those things and then come back to us and are like, you said this thing in episode 3. And we're like, yeah, we'll keep listening. We'll apologize in episode 5. Like, we'll get there. And at a certain point for Witch Please, we put an away message on the email and stopped going on the Twitter account because we're not there anymore. Like, we're not making it anymore. We can't keep up with it. We have 20,000 subscribers to that podcast, even though we haven't made an episode in a year. Like, we just can't keep up. And I imagine at some point with Secret Feminist Agenda, I'll have to do the same thing, which is to say, sort of emotionally set it free and be like, this was a project of the past and I can't keep up with how people are responding to it anymore. So that's like part of it, right? That at some point I'll just have to like stop being present in the moment of response to it. The question of archiving is kind of a different question, right?
Yeah.
Like, what do you do like to actually responsibly archive and make sure that these audio files aren't just like lost when I throw out my computer? And that actually is one of the research questions of our new grant.
Okay.
Yeah. We're like figuring out methods to basically make sure that scholarly podcasts can go into institutional repositories and be sort of saved by university libraries.
And that's like one of the big challenges too, right? Of like accessible scholarship. Oftentimes it's on blogs or on these podcasts. And then what happens when you sunset it? Yeah. Or that the technology doesn't work, or like people can't access this anymore.
Exactly.
And also like it's so like there's a bravery, right, to allow yourself to be so vulnerable, to allow people to interact with your past self.
Oh my God. I've just said so many bad things on pod, and that's a function of being like a scholar doing your work out loud, especially doing work that's not like edited in advance. Like the way that I make my podcasts, I often finish an episode like 3 hours before it goes up. Like I'm not running it by anybody else first. It's certainly like they get peer reviewed after the fact. They get peer reviewed at the end of a season. Like I'm not sending them to my editor. I don't even have time to run them by a friend. I'm just making them and then putting them out there and being like, hope this is okay. But then sometimes it's not, and people respond to me and are like, that wasn't okay. And a big part of learning to be a public-facing scholar has been for me developing the capacity to be like, I am sorry, here's how I'm going to fix this, here's how I'm going to avoid repeating it in the future, thank you for trusting me with that feedback, let's move forward. And that is a skill set I've really had to build.
Is there anything else you wish I had asked you?
I don't know.
Okay.
Let's find out what these people want to ask.
So it's open for questions now. Just so you know, we are recording the audio for this, but no one's going to be filmed. So,
I mean, we are.
Yeah.
I just want to thank you so much for that talk. Kind of like Alex, I don't want to spend some time fangirling. I'm a huge fan though. Listen to it, please. I'll see Current's Agenda, and I actually have reviews with me.
Amazing.
You should buy it. It's amazing. Anyways.
It's a good book. It's a beautiful book. Look at that fine cover.
Yes, it's gorgeous. And I just want to, thank you for all your work. You've given, I think I can speak for, I don't want to speak for everyone, but I think a language and a vocabulary to really articulate a lot of issues and just different ways of thinking. And thank you so much for that. But I kind of want to, you mentioned some points how you made Witch Please and Secret Feminist Agenda for fun.
Yeah.
And you kind of worked against like in the university internalizing this like serious scholarly pursuit. So I'm in a PhD program here at McGill, and I'm really tired.
Sorry, that was empathetic laughter. You listen to my podcast, you know that I panic laugh when people say relatable things.
And I'm really disillusioned with like the university as an institution, how you really do have to use the term unlearn a lot of things. And on your podcast, you speak about productivity and how capitalism works. That you always have to be working, but you have to take care of yourself as an individual. I'm just wondering. I mean, you speak about this on your podcast, but for someone who's kind of a tired PhD student, almost getting disillusioned with the university, could you perhaps give some advice on how to unlearn some of these things, or to carve out some space to have an alternative project, or to do something else, but to still feel good about doing that? I don't know if that makes sense, or it's all over the place.
But absolutely. Yeah, the key for me is friendship.
Yeah.
The key, because no matter how beaten down I have felt by the university, I have always managed to carve out some space and time for my friends, because those are sustaining and fundamentally valuable relationships for me, because I am not well if I am not spending time with my friends. And so that is always there for me, and it is always a source of pleasure, even when I am exhausted, even if all we are doing is lying on the couch sort of tilted, that thing where you're really tired and you just sort of tilt and hold each other up by your heads. Yeah, even if that's what we're doing, and then Marcel and I are rewatching the extended edition of The Fellowship of the Rings for the 78th time, just sort of like this, just drooling a little, but that whatever it is, even if you are completely burned out, that is still for me a space of renewal, a space of pleasure, a space of joy that energizes the work I do otherwise, that makes me feel more like myself, that helps me to remember that I'm a human being outside of this institution, which can somehow brainwash you into thinking you're not a person, that you're just like a scholarship producing robot. Like it's my little robot hands. Yeah, it's incredible how it can mess with your brain like that. So relationship for me is like the really key survival strategy. And so for both of these podcasts, they have been friendship projects. Like Witch Please, Marcel and I, before we were going to make a podcast, we just decided we wanted to reread the Harry Potter books together because we thought that would be fun. And then she was like, but what if we record it? And I was like, all right, cool. We had like a single microphone and we would just pass it back and forth, which is the only reason why I don't talk over her for the entire thing. If you're making a podcast with me, only one mic. So yeah, that was, and same thing with Secret Feminist Agenda, right? In a different way, but it was still for me about carving out time to be with friends and be with community, because that is what helps me to not burn out. And I think like you don't necessarily have to make a podcast with your friends. There's value in having conversations that aren't recorded, but like maybe you and your friends hang out and make zines, or maybe you and your friends hang out and make art, or maybe you and your friends hang out and paint t-shirts, or maybe you and your friends hang out and don't do anything. Mm-hmm. And that's still a really valuable way to be doing work outside the space of the university.
Thank you so much.
I'm new to this podcast and to your work, but I'm very interested, and thank you for sharing. I was wondering if in this accessibility project, there's also, like, if around your podcast there have been questions about translation or transcription, or because we're talking about reaching audiences, right? So I don't know. I'm here as someone who speaks English, but it's not my first language. Mm-hmm. So I just wonder about what interesting thoughts have come from the process, and anything that you would like to share about translation.
Yeah. Cool. Yes. As far as I'm aware, there's very little tradition of translation with podcasting. I'm not aware of there being much of that work being done at all. Transcription is a really central practice of podcasting. So we never managed to get Witch Please, or I should say have not yet managed to get Witch Please transcribed, and that's because we had no funding attached to it and no forms of support. At multiple times we sort of invited the listeners to like take on a sort of fan-led transcription project, and some people were sort of like, yeah, that sounds like a great idea, and then nobody did it, which is fair because it's a lot of work. But with Secret Feminist Agenda, I promised from the beginning that it would be transcribed because it's an explicitly feminist project and because it's a project that is about making scholarship accessible. And I was like, well, it has to be transcribed then, otherwise it's not accessible. And this was actually one of those really pivotal moments of being called to account by my listeners, because I said up front, the podcast will be transcribed, and then Finn did all of season 1 and like got into season 2 and had not followed up on that. It was just sort of in the back of my head as like, hey, yeah, it'll happen at some point. And a listener emailed me, a listener who had come over from Witch Please, and so who had known me and been following my work for some time, and said, you said you were going to transcribe this. You've never mentioned it again. My brother is hearing impaired. I want to share this work with him. I can't. I really feel like you've let your listeners down. And I had this moment where I was like, okay, like let me pause and think, like, yes, absolutely, I have failed you. Where did that come from? And I like paused. It's like, if I had a close friend or family member who is deaf or hearing impaired, transcription would have been at the top of my list of priorities. I would have done it right away without second guess. Like, that is just a absolutely classic example of how ableism functions. And I was like, I responded to the listener and said like, thank you. I know that it is hard to email people and ask them to do better, so I really appreciate you doing that. Here's what I'm gonna do next. And then like moved on, starting getting the transcriptions done. right away. And we haven't figured out yet a way to get it done in a timely fashion, so we transcribe the full season once it's completed, and my ideal would be to have transcriptions go up within the week of the episodes going up, which is a workflow challenge we haven't solved yet, but that is part of what we're, another thing we're going to try to solve with this next project. We're going to try to figure out how to make the workflow function such that transcription happens more readily, sort of in the same time frame as the episodes themselves going up. But I've had folks ask me about translation, and like I said, like there's no, as far as I can tell, just no sort of existing framework for that. So the transcriptions could be translated, but I'm not aware of anybody translating audio in that way. Yeah, so it's a really interesting question, and I wouldn't be surprised if that became more of a practice as podcasts continue to increase, like the degree to which they are a major form of media, but it doesn't seem to be yet. I think because people listen to them for the most part, and a big part of what people enjoy is the specific sound and cadence of hosts' voices, and a translation, hypothetically, right, it would be a different person speaking. So then is it a totally different podcast? Like, it's an interesting question how translation would work in relation to podcasts.
Yeah, in relation to the, I actually know of one, I
Mhm.
really know one, and it's a French one, or it's originally French. It's called La Poudre, it's Feminist too, and it has some, she just started having people on that are English speaking,
Mhm.
so she can speak a bit of English, and so she has French and then now she's still translated for her French audience.
Okay,
And
yeah.
it's really interesting.
Yeah, I'm thinking there is an
And
episode.
it's not very, I don't
Yeah.
love, like, I prefer just to listen to it in English
Yeah.
as I can. But, it's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, there's an episode of The Secret Life of Canada. It's a CBC podcast about the history of Canada, where the episode was about New Brunswick, and they were talking, there was like an interview with a, what is the French dialect they speak in New Brunswick?
The Acadian?
Shia.
Oh, the Shia.
Shia, yes, thank you. And so the interview, they released two different versions of the episode, one in which it was translated and one in which it wasn't. And you could choose which to listen to. And that's the only case in which they did that, and it was because they wanted to maintain the voice of the actual interviewee there in the podcast itself.
Also a big fan of both projects. I have a question about like feminism as a method. So I'm wondering, how do you compensate or compliment or support your guests? And do your guests get to listen to the episode before it comes out? Do they get feedback? Do they get their voice?
Yeah. I always give my guests the option of listening to or editing the episode before it comes out if they want to. I have only had 2 guests actually take me up on that. One of those people was Sarah Ahmed, who had to be really careful to not have, actually I shouldn't say what she had to be careful of because it was the thing she asked me to edit out. So she asked me to be very careful of a particular thing and asked if she could listen to it before I put it out. And so I made sure to sort of edit it in light of what I knew that she wanted and then send it to her so that she could check. And the other episode was a very complicated episode I made about the choir that I sing in, which is an all-women's choir. And I had invited one of my friends from the choir, who is a trans woman, to come and talk to me about specifically, like, 'cause she had talked to me in person about how exciting it was to come back to singing after transition, because she'd always thought after transition she'd never get to sing again. And that this particular musical genre, because it has very low women's parts, had been exciting for her because she was able to sing again. And I was like, oh, come and talk to me about like transition and singing and art and finding women's community in the choir. And so she came to do the interview, and then like once we were there, she was like, actually what I want to talk about is the fact that I was assaulted by another woman in the choir at a social event. And I want to talk about how that undermines the way that we talk about like the safety of women's spaces. And I was like, shit, well, yeah, okay. Like, if that's what you want to talk about, we will talk about that. Which is its own, I think, an example of how I care for my guests, which is it's okay if it makes me uncomfortable. If that's the thing you want to talk about on this episode, we'll talk about it. But then she very specifically wanted to get to hear that interview before it went up. And also, I specifically said, because like, I know that nobody else in my choir listens to the podcast. And so I said, I won't share it with them. It's up to you to decide whether or not you want this to be shared with that community. You can have total control over that. I tend to, when it comes to sort of the feminism of method, I try to just go for the most consent-based possible approach to how I interview people, how I edit people, how I circulate their episodes. So if you have anything you want me to do in the edits, I will do it. I will never include anything that makes you uncomfortable. I try to really minimize how much I change people's voices. I try not to alter people's sort of natural expression. I will edit out some ums and some likes to tighten things up, but I try not to like artificially transform people's voices so it doesn't sound like them anymore. And then I've never had anybody listen to an episode and say that they wanted something changed in hindsight. I'm trying to verify in my brain if that's true, and I think it is. But if they did, I would change it. My friend Andrea Warner, who's a music journalist in Vancouver, has talked to me about her personal approach as a like feminist music journalist, and that she tries to practice this really like consent-based interview style, which is that she would never like try to catch somebody out in an interview and then write an article based on a thing they hadn't meant to say or wouldn't have wanted put out about them. Just like, sure, like investigative journalism has its place and sometimes that's necessary, but like that's not how I'm going to treat my guests. Yeah. Thank you. We got time for both.
So thank you for the remarks. I was harking back to the moment when you talked about the importance of helping women equip themselves to cope with vitriol. Because there was social trauma and so on.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could just speak to moments when you found yourself in a mentorship role in that regard.
In a mentorship role, yeah.
Because I think at that point you were talking about a program that was never formed
Yeah.
to help with that. But what strategies have you suggested when people are coming to you, what to do when that happens?
Yeah. Oh, what a great question. The unfortunate thing that you realize pretty quickly when you start doing, so the first time that I ever got sort of badly trolled online, almost immediately I started getting all of these like emails and texts and messages from my larger feminist community who were like, oh, here's a guideline I have for what to do if you get doxxed. Here's the first 10 steps to make sure, like, everybody had all of these resources at hand, and I was like, what a bummer that we all have all of these resources ready to go to be like, oh, they got you, here's what you do. So part of it is that, like, just, I now also have those resources at hand. I now also am ready for, like, okay, so what do you do? So here's what you do. The first thing you do is make all of your social media accounts private immediately, because it just slows down, like, people get bored really, really quickly. And so if people are on Twitter trying to like find you and tag you and go after you and you can't, like, you're not there, they will lose interest in an hour and then you're gone. So like when I made that episode of Secret Feminist Agenda and people got mad, I just took the post down for a week. And none of those people ever bothered to go check if it was up again. I just put it back up and they were like, well, the post is deleted. And I was like, no, it's there. It's there. You just never checked. And so some of it's just those basic strategies. Like, what do? What you do is protect yourself first, go private, go silent if that's what's going to help you. But the other thing that I think is really, really important is recognizing what an emotional toll it takes and really taking that seriously. Like, my life has never been in danger as a function of the fact that Jonathan K. really hates me and like saying mean things about me on Twitter. But it feels very scary when men are mad at you for good reason. And even if they're not there in person, it still feels really scary. And I think taking that seriously and actually recognizing, like, which is now the thing, having experienced that in particular, now the thing that I try to say to other folks who are also experiencing it, like, this is scary and hard. Like, what do you need right now? Tends to be my response. Like, 1, go private right away. Don't engage. And 2, you know, what do you need? Do you need a hug? Do you need to talk this through? Do you need to cry? Do you need to drink? What are we gonna do? Yeah.
Actually, I'm new to Madrid and I don't know that much about the context of Canada or Montreal and things like this. My question may sound strange, but my main field of study is feminist masculinity study. I'm wondering, how do you see feminism in relationship with masculinity or masculinity studies and things like this?
Yeah, no, I know masculinity studies is a really significant field of, you know, women and gender studies and feminism as a field. And there's a lot of really interesting scholarship and work being done in masculinity studies, which I think would fall within the sort of rubric of the kind of stuff that I cover in Secret Feminist Agenda. So it's not like a strict refusal to talk about masculinity that has framed what I've done so far. It's just, like, it is kind of just an accident. Accident's the wrong word. It just hasn't happened yet. It's also just not my field as a scholar. Like, it is not, masculinity studies does not particularly interest me. I would be likely to talk to a scholar who studies it because I'm generally just interested in what other people do. But it's not my sweet spot, you know? Yeah.
Oh. Hi. It's kind of based on your question there, or a tangent off of it, but when you were talking about within which pleas, for example, how you don't want to retroactively edit out things you may have said it as a earlier than you are now feminist or activist or social justice warrior or whatever, and I think for me to, like, as you said, people were hungry for this kind of language, this kind of chat, this kind of podcast. It's, what it did for me was it showed me that it's in our culture of, like, if you want to be a feminist, you want to be vocal and you want to fight, it's the fear of saying something wrong and saying something stupid, and the likelihood of you being canceled for that is so real. Even within communities that you think you're safe in, like that you found your feminist friends and you want to, like, talk about something, or maybe like as a woman of color, my white feminist friend won't understand, and even like those delicacies there, or fragilities, you know. But what it did for me was it, like, provided time and again, you and Marcel provided examples of what that can be like, to be like, hey, this really hurt me, or I don't even know if I'm, like, brave enough to say that I wasn't cool with this, but that you were just like, oh my goodness, to take out that pause and just genuinely be like, I'm gonna think about what you said, I'm gonna say sorry because maybe I did fuck up, and no, I did fuck up.
It's like, not maybe, because you're telling me that it did, so I believe you.
And I know it sounds small, but it's radical to just have someone take that and not get defensive, and not be like, well, actually I meant this, and actually I meant that, and or just kind of, like, rule you out. Like, I can't count how many times I've just been like, oh, you know, she's too intense, and she got too emotional about that, and obviously she's overreacting, which I'm sure everyone, like, a lot of women can relate to. So, praise for that, yes, but also my question is, as someone who, like, identifies as a feminist and wants to speak up and fight those fights when it's safe for me, how do you navigate, like, that fear as being just you, Hannah, like, that fear of cancel culture, and that, like, yeah, like you're an academic and you said something real stupid and you like stay up at night thinking about it probably.
Why would
Like,
I say that?
Yeah, we've all been there.
I don't lose that much sleep over it.
That's
And part
great.
of it is that like it gets easier,
Yeah.
right? It gets easier the more you exercise it as a muscle, and that muscle is being vulnerable.
And being okay.
Being okay with being vulnerable.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's it. Like, and it's the vulnerability of saying, like, I'm gonna try, and I am going to ask you to trust me, and I'm gonna do my best. And that means I'm entering into an accord with you that when I do badly, you will tell me, and that I will try to do better.
Right.
Which means I am always inviting you to tell me if I have done badly, and will always be trying to do better. And part of that, there's this really beautiful apology that Marcel recorded on what I think might be our last episode of Which Please, like the last one that's currently up. Because maybe one day we'll make up new episodes, who knows?
Well, we're all waiting.
Yeah, same. I just keep, like, every once in a while, I'm like, hey, Marcel, done that dissertation yet? She's not. Yeah, and in that, like, she apologizes that she offers this slightly more lengthy than usual apology, where she reflects specifically on that feeling, but on the heightened political climate we live in, and that sense of if I say something wrong, like, I'll be in trouble, right? And how that makes you want to say nothing, how that makes you feel afraid, and how it sometimes makes you want to, what does she say, like, crawl into a hole and die? I think that's how she describes it.
Yeah.
And she's like, but it's okay, like, we have to trust one another to keep doing our best, and we have to give one another the benefit of the doubt, and we have to just, like, keep those open lines of dialogue. I really think that cancellation culture mostly has to do with media spectacle, and has less to do with how we actually can relate to one another and how we can actually form community. And that if we maintain this, like, I'm going to talk to you like a person, and I'm going to respond to you like a person, and I'm going to hear you, and, like, try to see where you're coming from, and try, like, and we're both just going to try our best, and we're both just going to keep working on trying our best. We're not going to suddenly cancel each other if we disagree. Like, you don't cancel people you're in a relation to, right? You cancel public figures. And so it's not like, if I'm trying to maintain a relationship with my listeners, it creates a different dynamic. I keep thinking about this moment when, there's been a lot of conversations in Vancouver about whether or not people should be using the spaces at the Vancouver Public Library. And that's because the Vancouver Public Library hosted an event organized by Megan Murphy, who is a famous transphobe, who is Vancouver-based, who is, like, so transphobic she got banned from Twitter, like, permanently. Like, that's a wild level of transphobia. But the Vancouver Public Library has this, like, room rental policy where they don't limit, like, anybody who wants to rent a room can rent a room. And when the queer and trans community was like, hey, VPL, you've said that you're allies, please cancel this event, the VPL was like, no. And so the VPL was uninvited from Pride this year. Like, a lot of people have been like, we need to stop working with them. I have continued to host events there and have had exchanges on Twitter with trans feminists who are friends of mine who have said, like, what are you doing? And I'm like, okay, like, here is how I have thought this through, here is how I have come to this conclusion. And they'll be like, I disagree, and I think that's indicative of your privilege. And I'm like, you're probably right, I'm gonna keep thinking about this. And then we move forward and nobody's canceled because, like, we're listening to each other and trying and being willing to, like, keep learning and thinking and understanding the really deep complexities of a lot of these issues. And, like, that, again, it's like, I don't know, because we're seeing each other as human beings. It means that we've got
But as you said,
somewhere to
that's
go.
a process that you really worked hard on.
Yeah.
And I think that you really, that's beautiful and the hope, the dream, but it's not a given, like, when you have those back and forths with people. So
yeah.
I guess
Yeah.
I know you don't have the, like, perfect answer, no one does, but it's just like, being radically compassionate rather than just like I'm smarter than you or I'm more academic or I'm more this or I'm more that.
Like
So-
like listening, like trying really hard to
Yeah.
listen to people and understand where they're coming from, trying really hard. It is, I think, a thing that people, I know that I have felt this way, I know Marcel has felt this way, I'm sure other people do as well, is that you expect of yourself, if you are a feminist, to not feel defensive or feel upset when people call you in. That you're like, oh, I should immediately be like, oh yes, of course. And if you have that instinctive feeling of like, oh, I hate this, then you're like, oh, I must be a bad person. And it's like, no, dude, it's fine to have a feeling. Like, what's not fine is for me to then take that feeling and make it your problem. It's my feeling. I will process it. I will process it with my friends. I will work through it. And then when I come back to you, I will do the work that I need to do, right? But I'm not going to be like, you just made me sad. Think about my sadness for a while, right? Which is like white lady 101. Just like, everybody think about how sad I am. So important. So that's part of it, right? Just like recognizing like you're allowed to have bad feelings.
Yeah.
Just like make them, just put them where they belong. And the other one, which has been a very important lesson for me, is that if there is a conversation going on in public, and maybe you have an opinion that you're not sure if it would be well received by your community, maybe you should keep that opinion to yourself. Like, maybe you don't always have to share every opinion. Like, there are moments where there are conversations happening, and I'm like, oh, I kind of don't agree with this, like, really prominent feminist. And then I'm like, well, maybe I should shut up. Like, my opinion is not always the opinion that needs to be shared in every situation. And I think that that is also an extremely online feeling of like, uh-oh, somebody's being wrong on the internet, I better get in there. Like, choose your battles. Yeah. Choose your battles and choose your context for conversation.
Yeah.
Right? Not everything is for the podcast, not everything is for social media, some things are for you and your friends. That's part of it too. Yeah.
Do you think?
Thank you.
Oh, I think one last question and then we're out of time. Yeah.
This doesn't totally relate to the podcast, but you're talking about how it was hard for you to sometimes have other people see the value in public work, especially in like bigger fields. And as I'm in business, and so sometimes I have seen a lot of people who don't necessarily take the public work as seriously as well. And I was just wondering what your biggest advice would be for continuing on despite other people not seeing it and trying to get legitimatize it.
Yeah, that is so, that question of how it is that we personally ascribe value to the work that we're doing and then convince other people to ascribe value to the work that we're doing is such a complicated one. And for me, the value really lies in the relationships that I'm able to build through the work that I'm doing. So I don't necessarily need other people to tell me if it matters. Like, it's nice when they do, but like, I know that it matters because the people who are listening to the podcast tell me that it matters to them. If they're not listening, I don't care if they think it matters. Like, they're not even part of the conversation. Right? So the work matters because of the work itself, like its value comes from within it. We have a lot of conversations in the world of public scholarship about how to, basically how to count it. So there's like how do you prove the impact of something? Because we've got all of these different conversations. So like, traditionally in academia, impact is determined by, one, how prestigious is the place where you published it. So it's like, oh, that's a really serious journal that rejects most articles. So that super matters. And then citation index, so how many people cited the thing that you did. And neither of those apply to podcasting. So then we go to the next one, which is like, well, how many people subscribe and how many people listen. But it shouldn't be a popularity contest. That's also, if we're going for popularity contests, feminism's always going to lose. So it's never going to be the most popular thing. Like, the most popular podcast, like the world's most popular podcast right now is Joe Rogan's podcast. So like, feminism's not going to win. So it can't be popularity either, right? It can't be prestige, it can't be numbers, it can't be money, it can't be popularity. So you just gotta find the thing like, what is it that makes you want to do this work? What about it keeps you going? Well, there's the value, right? Like, that's where it is. And if you can find a way to articulate that to people, that's great. But at the end of the day, like, it's really about you finding the value in that work.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for coming. I hope you come to the workshop tomorrow morning and to our other events, because we have another 15 this year.
Wow.
So, yeah.
It's it's too many events.
It's a lot of events, yeah. So, yeah. But, yeah, so thank you again, and have a good evening. Thank you.